Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Skip Rutherford. I'm Dean of the Clinton School. Welcome tonight. In another series of our public programs, let me say a special welcome to people that know a lot about highways that I recognize, but one particularly is the Speaker of the Arkansas House of Representatives, Speaker Robert Moore. Mr. Speaker, we're glad to have you here. And we have other people associated with the Highway Department, long associated with the interest of transportation. On November 17, 1993, by a vote of 234 to 200 in the House and 61 to 38 in the United States Senate, the Congress of the United States passed the North American Free Trade Agreement. It was signed into law by President Bill Clinton to take effect January the 1st, 1994. Even though the two were not necessarily directly connected, there became this immediate linkage between NAFTA and Interstate 69, the so-called NAFTA highway, or as some people thought, the Mecca from the sky that was going to save portions of this country. Battles started taking place between political delegations. Everyone in Arkansas is familiar of the battle between J. Dickey and Trent Lott and other places that across the country that took place. If completed, this highway would stretch from the Canadian border to the Mexican border. Matt Dellinger, a well-known writer who has written for such publications as New Yorker, The Atlantic, the Smithsonian, New York Times, and even has written for the Oxford American, has done a great book about this highway and its unfinished history. When Bill Clinton was elected president, or when we started building the presidential library, I got a letter from David Eisenhower, the grandson of President Eisenhower, who said, these two presidents have a lot in common. It was Eisenhower who did the interstate system that linked America, and it was during the Clinton years that the internet system grew and expanded in terms of commerce. Still missing in that great story is the completion of I-69. And will it ever happen or not? But one thing we do know, it is an incredible story that continues, and we're honored to have the author who knows more about it than I presume anybody in the country from a national view with us. Would you please welcome Matt Dellinger.
Thank you, Dean Rutherford, and I'd like to thank Nikolai and the whole Clinton School. This is a great institution and a great setting here in an old passenger terminal, rail terminal, beside this brand new bike and pedestrian path for me to talk about interstates. We've got the whole transportation ecosystem represented here. That's right, I-30 you can see, or 30. It is true that I think I know more than any other human being about Interstate 69, and I like to joke that I knew I was done with my reporting when I started to answer more questions than ask when I was meeting with some of the people who had even been working on this for 20 or so years. So for those of you who aren't totally familiar with Interstate 69 and maybe its whole national route, I brought a map. This map appears in my book. The existing portion of Interstate 69 goes north from Indianapolis up into Canada around Detroit. It's not the heavy black line. And that was part of the original interstate system as imagined back in the 50s. It was passed as legislation, and it was actually the 40s when it was sort of drawn up. The heavy line here is the new I-69. It's what was proposed 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago now, and that's really the subject of my book. I did not set out to be a transportation wonk or a transportation expert. It's kind of maybe immediately a dry seeming field, and I got a lot of backhanded compliments about the book, people saying that it was way more interesting than they expected, things like that. But what really drew me to the story of Interstate 69 were the people in all the small towns up and down the route struggling to either build Interstate 69 or in some cases struggling to stop it. And so tonight I'm going to quickly talk you through the history of the whole route. I'm trying to accomplish a lot, so just wave at me if I start to go over time. And I also want to encapsulate for you kind of the history of how we pay for funding, how we fund and pay for and decide on what gets built, and how that is actually potentially changing quite a bit as we speak. So I mentioned the people. These were the first people I interviewed. I'm from Indianapolis, and these are some of my old neighbors from Bloomington. On the left, it's Thomas and Sandra Tchaikovsky. They've been working since the late 80s against Interstate 69, because Interstate 69 started out as just a road from Indianapolis to Evansville, Indiana. It was a state project. The people in Evansville, Indiana wanted it. They felt left out. They were the third largest city in the state, and they were not connected to the capital by interstate. So a group of people in Evansville set out to try to lobby for a highway. And the state did all these studies. Maybe it could be a toll road through Terre Haute. Maybe it could be an interstate through Bloomington. All of the studies said that there was no reason to build such a road. It would have a negative cost-benefit analysis, or at least a not high enough cost-benefit analysis. And I'll tell you how this happened, but the line you see here is really an elongation of that little road in Indiana. The people in Indiana they drove this route, and they talked to people, and they got a coalition formed around building an international highway because they could not justify a short intrastate highway. The opposition in Bloomington, Indiana has been rather extreme at times. This is a group of young anarchists. As you may know, the NAFTA label for Interstate 69 kind of got turned around, and as NAFTA became less popular and people's fears about globalization peaked in the last decade or so, a lot of people latched onto Interstate 69 thinking it was the spine of a international conspiracy to unite the three countries into the North American Union and do away with the American dollar and open the borders. There is no such plan, at least from the government's point of view, and from most people's point of view. Interstate 69 was never really part of that. It was barely part of NAFTA. But these people people react to I-69 in ways that really don't necessarily have to make literal sense. Interstate 69 has become a Rorschach test. So whatever you want for your community, whatever you fear about happening to your community, Interstate 69 comes to represent. It's going to destroy the beautiful setting we live in. It's going to bring jobs. It's going to let our kids stay here longer and have jobs. It's going to help our kids go away. The project has had this amazing effect on people. Skip was referencing the people in Arkansas and how they're sort of expecting it to be manna from heaven, and that's not unusual at all. There were a lot of people in a lot of small towns. Down in Texas, they don't do torches in Texas. It's a different style there. This was a rally, actually. I don't know if you remember when Rick Perry proposed something called the Trans-Texas Corridor that got him in a bit of trouble. He was proposing that the state, with the help of the private sector, build many, many miles of huge corridor, which would have separate truck lanes and rail, underground utilities, and these swaths could be a quarter-mile wide. And he very much upset the property rights folks down in Texas. This rally was actually protesting the interstates and a proposal to tag animals. They saw something in common there, a kind of big brother threat, and came out. It was called the Don't Tag Texas rally. But there's a lot of places, obviously, that are very hungry for Interstate 69. I open and close the book with the town of Haynesville, Louisiana, which is miles and miles from an interstate. It's miles even from a 4-lane road. And when the local pharmacist painted this mural of all the things that the town of Haynesville was known for and proud of, There, by the American flag, you can see the Interstate 69 represented as kind of the future of Haynesville. It was going to be the thing that would come and save Haynesville. This is the Great River Bridge, which is supposed to cross from Mississippi to Arkansas, or near Arkansas City, Utah landing on the Mississippi side, not far north of Greenville, Mississippi. There's a record of decision. All the environmental work is done, the design work is done, and they're just waiting for money. This segment was one of my favorite parts to report. Arkansas City was kind of a great example of how transportation can make or break a place. I had all these epiphanies as I was writing the book, and one of them was Arkansas City. Essentially, it was a river town. It was right on the Mississippi River. Mark Twain wrote about it, and it had an opera house, and people would gamble and get drunk, and they had a drunk pen, and it was a real lively place. And then the 1927 flood comes, and it changes the course of the Mississippi River, and Arkansas City is stranded. It's landlocked. It's no longer on the river. And today it has just a couple hundred people. But if this bridge is ever built, Arkansas City will once again be on the river. It'll be on the interstate, the concrete river that we use today for our commerce. So I mentioned the people in Indiana who were kind of responsible for making this happen. On the right is a man named David Graham. On the left, Jim Newland. In the middle is the longtime mayor of Dyersburg, Tennessee, Bill Revell. One of the favorite people I met during this time here. He was mayor for over 20 years and did a lot for Dyersburg. He made me want to be a small-town mayor one day. I don't know if that'll ever happen, but David Graham on the right, a very interesting man. He's in his 90s now, and he was born in southern Indiana. He was actually, his father was the head of the Automotive Chamber of Commerce for the U.S. Automotive industry, and helped to build, his grandfather helped to build a railroad depot in his hometown of Washington, Indiana. So his history is his father and his two uncles built cars in Evansville, so he had ties to Evansville, ties to transportation. And as his pet retirement project, when he retired in like 1990, he decided to put his shoulder to the wheel and try to help build Interstate 69 in Indiana. And when they told him no, when the studies turned out negative, he despaired. But then an economist was staying at his house. They were having breakfast one morning. The economist was there working for the Hudson Institute and doing a study on southern Indiana, trying to figure out the source of its economic ills and what could be done to improve upon them. And David Graham started to tell David Reed, the economist, about the Interstate 69 plan. And David Reed, this was a new idea to him. He came to it fresh. And he looks at the maps with them and he says, you know, this is never going to be built because nobody gives a damn about Indiana, pardon the language. That's what he said. And he said, but if you continue it south, if you kind of, NAFTA was just about to be passed and everyone was expecting this new era of trade. If you bring it down south through Texas, through Memphis, through Houston, then you've got a shot. Because not only will, he knew how the economic studies work. He knew that the numbers would suddenly sing, you know, connecting to Indianapolis to Houston, the numbers say something totally different than if you just connect it to Evansville. And he reasoned that you would pick up the senators and representatives along the route as well and have a much bigger coalition in Washington. So they went to Washington and tried to get interest. They tried to get interest from the Indiana State House and from Washington. That didn't really work. So David Graham on the right there got in his car one summer and he was vacationing in Mexico. And on his drive home from vacation in Mexico, he stopped at the Chamber of Commerce in Houston and the Chamber of Commerce in Shreveport and a few other places. And in Shreveport, he met a man named John Carruthers, who happened to know a senator, Senator Johnston from Louisiana. And Senator Johnston happened to be very powerful and inserted language into the iced tea bill in 1991, which was the very beginning of the legislative existence of I-69. And so these men, usually mostly older, mostly white men, got together in Memphis every year from their various towns with their various agendas. Many of them wanted, some of them were from growing cities like Houston, which badly needed more transportation. So sort of, they're here, we need to build it. Some people came from small towns in Arkansas, we want to build it, so they come. All different places in the economic spectrum, all different sized cities. They would gather in Memphis every year and sort of coordinate and plan. That last photo was taken at the groundbreaking in Indiana, in Evansville, Indiana. This looks a little different than some of the other groundbreaking photos you may have seen or attended, some of you, because it's indoors. And the groundbreaking was held indoors because of the folks with the torches that I showed you earlier. They were afraid that there would be a disturbance at the groundbreaking, and so they filled up a dump truck full of dirt from the construction site. They drove it to the Evansville Convention Center, dumped it onto a blue tarp there, and dug in with their gold shovels. The road is also under construction around Memphis. This is a part of the Western Loop. It's going to be 269, sort of from Millington in the north, all the way around Collierville and Byhalia. And then the southern part of that is actually, has broken ground, is open to traffic. And I was lucky enough to attend the ribbon cutting. Many of you know who that is, Senator Trent Lott. And as Skip was mentioning, there was quite a bit of wrangling back in the 90s over where Interstate 69 would go. It was like a developing photograph. So the original language said that there would be a road from Indianapolis to Houston through Shreveport. The through Shreveport part was put in by Bennett Johnston. And then there was going to be another road from the Mississippi, from Laredo up to Houston. And then later bills combined those into one road. But until the mid-90s, it didn't say where it was going to go between Memphis and Shreveport. And it could go through Mississippi and then cross at Greenville. It could cross at Memphis and go almost entirely through Arkansas. And of course, as I learned, every highway map is a political map. This is a political map of the mid-1990s, where you had Bill Clinton's Arkansas and Jay Dickey's Arkansas across the river from Trent Lott's Mississippi. And from what I was told, Trent Lott basically said, you know, if this road doesn't go through Mississippi, there's not going to be an I-69. But he was in the mid-90s, he was wrangling with Jay Dickey, and I have labeled there, it's kind of hard to read this map, but Jay Dickey proposed the Dickey split, it was called, and it was, how about, what if I-69, what if there were two I-69s between Memphis and Shreveport? You can have yours through Mississippi, and you can cross wherever you want, and then we'll have one going through Pine Bluff, which was Jay Dickey's hometown. It didn't quite work. He failed. I believe he reached out to Clinton to try to get, you know, call in the big guns, and Clinton refrained from taking up that fight with Trent Lott. I think he had other fights to fight. And so the legislation was written to take it across that bridge I showed you, the Great River Bridge, which, by the way, had been planned way before I-69. It was a 1984 plan, just by local engineers in the Mississippi Delta. But Jay Dickey left Congress and became a lobbyist. And the way you got money for transportation projects, at least over the last 15, 20 years, was through earmarks. These gigantic appropriation bills every 6 years or so would sail through. They were very popular. There was never much of a fight over them. And the reason was because inside that gigantic transportation bill was everybody's pet project. And this earmarking, you know, today it's sort of taboo. It's thought of as a terrible thing to earmark. But a lot of people have, including a lot of the former transportation chairs, have come to the defense of earmarking, and they argue that if we don't earmark this money, which is our job as Congress people, then we just end up giving lumps of money to the state, where it's going to be an arbitrary decision at a different level, and then you've got to work with, you know, The governor of Mississippi may have one thing in mind, the governor of Arkansas may have another in mind. And, but in any way, in those days, it was all earmarks. And so J. Dickey, as a lobbyist, would bring the chairman of the House Transportation Committee, first Bud Schuster of Pennsylvania, and then Don Young of Alaska. He would bring them to Arkansas and have fundraisers for them and raise a lot of money. And so in Schuster's bill in 1995, which was called T-21, he got $100 million, which was a remarkable sum for the Pine Bluff connector, connecting Pine Bluff to I-69. And then in the next appropriation bill in 2005, he got an additional $74 million for that road. The irony of that was that there were not such earmarks for I-69 itself. So you had the Arkansas Highway people building a connector without anything to connect to. And where did they start building the connector? They did not start building it in Pine Bluff, where there's already highways and you continue it. You start building at the bottom in Wilmer, where you're in the middle of nowhere and you're building an interstate up. And the reason you do that is because it will seem much more inevitable that it be completed if you start at the other end. So these people they're very clever. I talked about the pet projects. This was when Interstate 69 came about in the early 90s. 1991 was a landmark transportation bill called ICE-T, Intermodal Surface Transportation Equity Act. And the core of the act actually said we're done building the interstates. So this is the first post-interstate bill. And it gave a lot of flexibility to the states. If you want to take highway money and you want to build rail or you want to build transit or bike paths, you can do that. But of course it said there is still a federal interest in keeping a national road network going. And so we're going to make an exception with this end of the interstate thing. We're going to pick a few roads that are important to maintain or need to be expanded, and those are going to be high priority projects. Well, I'm not sure how high the numbering here goes, but it's above 40. It kind of ballooned, and suddenly everyone's little project. Some of these are existing interstates, like actually the red one in the middle of the country is I-35, which became the de facto NAFTA highway, just because with the increased truck traffic, that's the one they took. It was the easiest route between the two countries. So there were a lot of pet projects. It was hard to tell what was a true priority. And sometimes, the Interstate 69 people hired their own lobbyist, and she would go, and oftentimes you would earmark things not by saying this much money for Interstate 69, but you would create an entire program, and the description of that program was it was to pay for projects of this nature. And of that nature would basically point directly to I-69. So there would be the International Corridors Program or the Border Infrastructure Program. And these were created by lobbyists with the idea of funding Interstate 69, but in order to get the votes to pass them, you had to include everyone else's project. And it was kind of a very complex system, but it worked for many years. But that method of funding highways was not always thus. And this is Carl Fisher. Anyone know who Carl Fisher is or heard of him? He's one of the most amazing people I've ever read about. I recommend a biography of him called The Pace Setter. He just did the short version of his resume. He started the Indianapolis 500. He developed Miami Beach, Florida. He headed up the coalition to build the Lincoln Highway, the first coast-to-coast paved highway. And he also headed up the Dixie Highway Coalition. And when he got the idea for the Lincoln Highway, he was one of the first car salesmen in Indiana. He made a zillion dollars selling headlights, and he raced bikes back in the day, then he raced automobiles, and he was just kind of an adventurer. And he thought that there should be a coast-to-coast road, and it was a kind of a patriotic feeling he had. So he put together a coalition, much as David Graham did for I-69. But there was not much precedent. This was in the 19-teens, and there was no federal aid highway program yet. They did not yet use federal funds to build roads. Most of the paved roads in America were inside city limits. And then to go in between the cities, not on the railroad, you'd have to go through the mud and move a fence over and keep going. And Carl Fisher's idea for how to pay for this road was he thought that the auto industry should pay for the road. And he got his auto industry buddies together and he said, I've got this great idea and we're going to be the beneficiaries of it because people are going to want to buy cars. They'll suddenly have a place to go. Why don't we all chip in a portion of our profits to pay for this great road? Which, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense. Very different than what we're doing, but it does make sense. And famously, Henry Ford said no. A lot of them said yes and gave money to the Lincoln Highway Association. And Henry Ford said, it's my job to make cheap cars. It's the government's job to build roads. And he turned out to be right, or he decided it. I'm not sure which. In 1939, after the Lincoln Highway was more or less complete, FDR got it in his head that there should be a national road network. And the story is he sketched on a piece of paper 3 east-west and 3 north-south roads. And he took it to Thomas McDonald, the head of the Bureau of Public Roads back then, and said, I want a report on how this would get built and how it could be paid for. And he suggested strongly paying for it with tolls. FDR did. And Thomas McDonald came back with a report that said that tolls were a terrible idea. The cynical view is that it would take power out of his hands because he was running the federal program. But in any case, this branch off in the 30s where we pursued, looks remarkably like the interstate system. This was actually drawn in 1939. It was not funded then, but that's how old this idea was. And FDR had all of these ideas for how it should be paid for. He didn't think you should go to the big pool of tax money to pay for roads. He thought they should be tolls, where tolls would support them. And he even thought that the way that the Transcontinental Railroad was built was an interesting idea, where you would take excess land on either side of the road. The government would buy extra right-of-way. And then because of the road, that land would increase in value, and the government would then sell or lease back that land after it had risen in value when the road was built, and in that way capture the value created by the road in order to pay for the road. That was, I think, thought of as sort of quasi-communism, so he didn't succeed in selling that. But there are programs today, the tax incremental finance program, that are closely related to that, where basically you say, I want to build a trolley line, and you measure all the property taxes being collected along that, and then as that jumps, you capture a portion of that to pay for the infrastructure. And these two guys were the ones who got together in 1956. Skip mentioned Eisenhower, and he was kind of if you think about Obama's high-speed rail plan, which isn't really Obama's because it had been sitting around for quite a while already, and then he champions it, and it doesn't look like it's going to be built anytime soon. But if it is built in 10 years or 20 years, whoever the president is then may be remembered as the person who built the high-speed rail in America, just as Eisenhower is remembered as the guy who built the interstates in America. Eisenhower was very much in favor of building the interstate system. He did have personal experience over in Europe during World War II and saw the German Autobahn and all of that. But he basically took an existing plan, and he was in the White House when these two guys figured out how to actually pay for it. And this is Al Gore Sr., senator from Tennessee, and Hale Boggs from Louisiana, two good Southern guys. They created the Highway Trust Fund, which is what we have today. Basically all the gas tax that you pay, the federal gas tax, certain excise fees for trucks go into this big trust fund in Washington, and then that money, through these giant appropriation bills, is sent back out to certain projects and to the states. But this is what's happening to the gas tax. The cars are becoming more efficient. They're burning less fuel per mile driven. And the system that we built is aging. And so all of this adds up to a rather significant infrastructure crisis. And the gas tax has not been increased since the early 90s. It's pennies on the dollar, so that the cost of gas does not affect how much tax is collected. And essentially, the Highway Trust Fund is now broke. So the possible answers to this are to raise the gas tax, which is a political non-starter, is the conventional wisdom anyway, or you find another way to pay for it. One popular idea is a mileage fee, where people would basically, the technology wasn't there in 1956, but now it is. You combine OnStar with kind of reliable odometers with the kind of easy pass systems, and you could create a system where you pay by the mile as you drive. And why not treat roads like a utility? You use a certain amount of water, you pay a certain amount, no matter where you drive. That's another idea. The idea in Congress now, though, is to let the states figure it out. And this is the transportation chairman right now, Representative Mica of Florida. And all of this transportation policy is coming to a head right now in the kind of fractured Washington that we have today. They're trying to solve this enormous problem. And the House Transportation Committee put forth a bill that couldn't even get enough Republicans to support it to pass. Some of the major changes were that it would help pay for roads through drilling, domestic drilling, and it was going to do away with all of the expenditures from the Highway Trust Fund that were not on highways. Right now, about 10% goes towards bike paths, beautification, things of that nature, and then a healthy chunk goes to transit, which was set up during the Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan actually raised gas taxes and thought it was important and thought it was justified because it was as close to a user fee as any tax the government collected. So the Mica Bill died before it even left the House. The Senate passed a bill that was championed by the White House and the Secretary of Transportation, LaHood, there on the left. And that was a 2-year extension to kind of get us past, ideally, past the current rancor in Washington, get us over that election hump when maybe there'd be a little bit more political freedom to make some tough choices. I'll take some bets on that if you want. But even in this climate, the Obama administration has used its discretionary spending powers to do a lot of things on the other end of the spectrum from what the House proposed. They've been directing a lot more money towards running and biking paths, rail infrastructure. They have something called the Tiger program. Things like right out here are perfect, taking abandoned brownfields, bridges that are no longer used, and fixing them up, repurposing them, not just rails to trails, but all kinds of things. And it's a little bit more of an urban focus. So think the population shifts now are towards metropolitan areas, and the idea of the current administration being we need to focus on fleshing out the rest of the transportation ecosystem that we've been ignoring for 50 years. And this is the kind of dull thing I attend. This is a Metropolitan Planning Organization meeting in Bloomington, Indiana, just to bring it back home. Bloomington, Indiana realized a little too late that it actually had the power as a local government to stop I-69, in a manner of speaking. If the local government, MPO, which is a Metropolitan Planning Organization, didn't put I-69 in its plan, the state would be unable to spend federal funds on that project inside the MPO. So for the last year, the state, this is the deputy director of INDOT, who came to that microphone and voiced a threat that he'd been apparently making in private for a while, which was that the Indiana Department of Transportation would cut all of their discretionary funding for things like bike paths and bus service if the MPO didn't play ball. And just 2 weeks ago, the MPO caved in and, by one vote, added I-69 to its local plan, which I think illustrates a little bit about the, not just the complex way that all of these things are decided, that the MPO didn't even know it had this power, but also how you really won't solve much if you send all the money back to the states. I think Arkansas actually has a very rare transportation system. Are there Arkansas Highway people here tonight? Anyone? Yeah, the commission basically decides everything, right? Instead of the governor, is that true? They pick projects, and is there nodding? Is there yes? sort of. In some states, the governor is all-powerful and directs his transportation agency to do something. In other places, there's a commission that's more powerful than the governor. And the country is kind of this hodgepodge of state systems. So was anyone aware when in New York City, the governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, canceled a rail tunnel under the Hudson River? This was something that the entire tri-state region had been studying and planning for and squirreling away money on for years. And one governor comes along and he's a budget cutter, and he just pulled the plug, and all of the work and all of the money is kind of set aside. So all of that to say that it's a little more complicated than it's a state matter, because bridges like the one down here have to go from state to state, and you need some kind of federal coordination if you're going to have some kind of federal system. So that's basically my presentation. I want to open it up to questions, and I'll leave the map here because I think the map is useful to look at. But thank you very much. I think we're, to put a cap on it, we're at this point now, and if you start paying attention to it, you'll kind of hear all these undercurrents as well. But we're at a moment in American history where there's as little certainty about what we're going to build and how we're going to decide what to build and how we're going to pay for it than there has been in 60 years. So it's a very interesting time for transportation.
Yes, sir, we got a question right back here. If you'll wait for the microphone.
It was my understanding when they started the interstate highway system, it cost about $1 million a mile on average to build. What is the current cost of that per mile today?
I feel like I'm on Jeopardy. I don't know, but it's more than $1 million. I know that $8 million? Yeah. I've heard of billion. I mean, in Texas, I don't know if you've all driven into Houston. They'll spend $1 billion on an interchange. That might be hyperbole, but I'm not sure. I mean, they do flyovers, every possible. You're going from road A to road B or road B to road C. Every single possible turn has a flyover, and they fly over each other. And these engineers, they like to build stuff, and so it's getting more and more expensive. I mean, the cost of materials goes up with the cost of oil.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. Coming with a mic.
I was just curious. I bought the book a couple of years ago, and what was your experiences in the Shea County, and especially you mentioned riding around with the county judge down there?
DeShay County is a fantastic place. The people I met there, Charlotte Snyder, I was just talking to Skip about Charlotte, is a local woman who was, ran the newspaper, and then she was a state representative, and she was actually, there's a photo of her standing over Governor Bill Clinton, having him sign the bridge compact between the two states that started the work on this. I mean, they were tirelessly working over this. They saw it as a total game changer, and Michael Jones, who's a banker down there, and Judge McElroy, they were very colorful, delight to spend time with, but also extremely dedicated to their local community. I mean, this happened during a period where my reporting of the book, just on a personal note, I feel like a lot of cynicism cropped up about, governing in this country during that time. And I personally had the pleasure of meeting all of these small town mayors and state representatives and people who are kind of where the rubber meets the road, if you will, and they really do make a difference in their community. And I could tell from one town to another that some of these mayors had dedicated their lives, and it was paying off. I mean, it makes a big difference. And if you're a company, a lot of this is about economic development. And if you're a company coming to work, trying to find a place to plop down your Toyota plant or your furniture factory or something, there's a lot of things that factor into that decision. And obviously one of them is how close you are to an interstate. But another thing is just the character of the people and the people running the town. And you want to be sure that there's a good workforce and good leadership. And I talk about it a lot in the book. I didn't make it part of this presentation, but economic development in this country is fascinating what happens. It's a little bit cloak and dagger. Toyota will hire a company and they'll show up. They won't introduce themselves. They'll just, they'll go to the economic development office. Sometimes they've already flown over in a helicopter. They don't give you their business cards, and they just ask all these questions. And Where's your water lines? Can your electric handle this? Can it do that? And it's become such that, are they called super sites? What are they called? Mega sites. Is anyone familiar with the mega site idea? Where a town will actually set aside 60 acres, 100 acres, and they'll run all the utilities out to it, and they'll have it ready to go, so it's shovel ready, that term, for a company to just come down and plunk away. So now Toyota can just shop from a list of mega sites around the country.
Yes, right back here in the back.
First of all, thank you for coming. This is
my pleasure.
very, very interesting to all of us here in this state. This is actually a two-part question, and you touched on this a little bit before. That looks like a pretty complete highway from Indianapolis all the way down to Laredo, and you mentioned that there are some parts of it that have already gotten started building. Mm-hmm. Could you go back and let us know what areas are definitely already built, have been built, are in the planning stages, and which ones are not?
Sure.
And the second part of the question is this all federally funded, or do the states put in money on this, and is that why some of them sections aren't getting built? Okay,
yes, it's largely up to the states. As I say, this project came about at a time when the federal spigot for this exact kind of project was turned off. And so each of these states has kind of had to struggle on its own with how to pay for it. Just starting at the top, and again, the heavy line is the proposed, so that doesn't mean it exists. In Indiana, they're starting from Evansville north, and they are, by the end of Governor Mitch Daniels' term, they expect to be on Bloomington's back door. They paid for that by leasing the Indiana Toll Road. So a Spanish and Australian consortium leased the Indiana Toll Road for, I believe, 75 years. They now have the right to toll it, and after a certain number of years, they can increase those tolls. Based on the money they expected to make, they gave the state of Indiana $3.6 billion for the pleasure of tolling that road. The sum was so large it had to be sent in 2 wire transfers, which happened, I believe, to the day on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the 1956 Highway Bill. Kentucky is using existing parkways in a little section of 24. Those parkways were built after the interstate passed Western Kentucky by. Western Kentucky said, we're going to do it ourselves, and they built their own toll roads, tolled themselves, and the promise was that as soon as they paid for themselves, they would take the tolls off, and they have. That's rare in this country, but they actually did take the tolls off. But the exits and on-ramps and off-ramps are made for slowing down to pay a toll. They're not made for trucks traveling 40 miles an hour, so they have to raise some bridges, improve some exits, but there are signs that say future I-69 corridor all along the Kentucky parkways. Tennessee, there's construction happening around Union City. If you know northwestern Tennessee, around Dyersburg, there's an existing I-55 spur from across the river. They're starting to build down towards Union City. The new loop around Memphis is under construction. There's a piece already open. The first new piece of I-69, which I got to drive on, was 9 miles at kind of east-west, ironically, right underneath Memphis. Mississippi is going to turn the historic Highway 61. They've already they have a 4-lane Highway 61. That's going to become Interstate 69. The bridge, who knows? Arkansas just broke ground in November, right on 8.5 miles from just north of McGee and Monticello, that section. And of course, the Pine Bluff connector is underway. Louisiana was kind of the late to the party. They're still finishing up their studies. They had some trouble because the road, after it crossed the Red River near the port of Shreveport, was going to take out some pecan trees at a Louisiana State University pecan study station. So they had to halt everything and figure out something else. How pecans changed history. It's my next book. And then in Texas is basically upgrading existing roads, which the irony of Rick Perry's Trans-Texas Corridor plan was that the original Interstate 69 plan was so uncontroversial. They were going to take already 4-lane U.S. highways through not very urban stretches and just do a little bit of work, to close off the crossings and build bridges and everything. And it was non-controversial. It didn't bother anybody until Rick Perry came up with this private toll road plan, and then everyone's up in arms. So now there is actually political opposition to the original plan, even though it was non-controversial. But they have sections just south of Corpus Christi. There's some sections with the I-69 sign up where they've improved it to interstate standards. Again, just like 5 miles worth. So you can drive on I-69 probably not more than 10 minutes at a time, and you've got to drive on a lot of little roads to get between the pieces.
We have a question, yes, sir, right here. Come over there to the microphone.
Land acquisition for the right-of-way, is that by eminent domain or private negotiations?
All eminent domain. Even in the proposals for the building of private toll roads, the state would it would exercise its power of eminent domain to take the land, and it would maintain ownership of the land. The private company would operate it for a defined period of time.
Might be interested in knowing, everyone, that he referred to Charlotte Snyder, the legendary newspaper woman, businesswoman, legislator. She is writing a book, and her book will be published this summer, and I'm sure we'll get the Dumas version of I-69 in the book, as we will probably get many points from this very interesting woman. Let's thank Matt very much for being with us, and now come buy your copies and sign Interstate 69, which remains a very strong political issue in our state. Matt.